Hey vintage fans! If you've seen my Dinner in the Great Hall video from my visit to the Harry Potter exhibition at Warner Brothers Studios, you'll notice that I'm wearing a Marauders Map print vintage inspired dress in a 1950s style. If not, click the link in the description and check it out. Well, as I sewed the dress myself using a vintage sewing pattern, I thought I'd make a video showing you how I put it together. Let's go, chaps! So for this project I wanted to combine colours and prints which would evoke a Harry Potter theme without looking like a costume, and I also wanted to give it a twist by making it up into a vintage style dress. Therefore I chose a Marauders Map print cotton from eBay and a maroon polyester satin from my local fabric shop. As the print fabric was quite weighty and matte without any sheen, I added the satin to elevate the dress to an evening look. I made sure the satin matched the patches of maroon on the Marauders Map print as closely as possible, in order to tie the whole look together. The pattern is Simplicity 1155, a 1950s reproduction pattern with a boned lined bodice and a full skirt. The bodice is a shelf bust style featuring pleated bust inserts, a front band, and bands which curve from the back through to the top of the bodice to form the shoulder straps. There is also an option to add a bow. Although there's two design options for this pattern, A and B, I really couldn't see any difference between the two, and the pattern pieces for both were exactly the same, so I was a little confused. Before I go any further, I have to admit that I didn't make a muslin for this dress. This is because I was simply way too impatient to get started and had started making the dress way too late. It's fair to say I underestimated the trickiness of this pattern, and it certainly put me through the mill. The moral of the story? Make a muslin. So, after cutting out all the pattern pieces, I transferred the pattern marking to the fabric using tailor tacks in contrasting thread. I made sure I placed the maroon diamond of the print slap bang in the middle of the front bodice piece for maximum impact. I then stay stitched the upper edges of the bodice pieces to prevent the curved edges from stretching, and stitched together the bodice side and front pieces before stitching together the front band, turning it right side out and basting it to the front of the bodice. I had to leave two small gaps open to insert the back band and strap through later. Next came the pleated bust inserts. This was a tricky process as the fabric was so slippery. It was difficult pulling the edges up and getting them to stay in place, so I tacked them together from the reverse of each pleat before basting all the pleats into place at the inner edges. I then stitched a facing piece in the same fabric to the right side of each pleated piece and turned them inside out. Finally, I stitched the two inserts together, placing them to match the pattern markings, before slip stitching them together by hand at the reverse to keep them from shifting around. With the bust insert section completed, I basted it to the front bodice piece, making sure not to stitch through the front band. I then stitched the side and back bodice pieces together and attached them to the front bodice. Now the next step was to stitch together the front and side skirt pieces. The skirt is made up of a total of 5 pieces, laid out so the seams fall in the folds of the skirt and it has a seamless look at the centre front. For this dress this was perfect as the pattern of the print wasn't disrupted. I stitched the back panels to the side pieces before stitching them together at the centre back, leaving the upper portion open to accommodate the zip. It was then time to stitch the bodice and skirt together, matching the pattern markings before pressing the seam towards the bodice. Next, the zip. In brief, I basted the right side of an invisible zipper to the right side of the zipper opening, then stitched it in place using my zipper foot before repeating on the other side. I then closed the zip and secured the bottom of the zipper in place with additional stitching. Now my skills in terms of invisible zip application are not fantastic, and it is a gamble as to how they come out each time. However, on this occasion I think the zip came out reasonably well. With the zip applied, it was time to insert the boning into the dress lining. I started by stitching together the lining pieces, before pressing and sewing a further seam 3/8 of an inch within each seam allowance, stitching through all the thicknesses to form boning channels. Next, I cut strips of plastic boning to the appropriate length for each channel, leaving 5/8 of an inch free at each end for the seam allowances. I then rounded off the ends so they wouldn't poke through the lining and inserted the pieces into the channels before basting the edges. Now I have to say, having since used spiral steel boning on another project, the steel option is, in my opinion, far superior to the plastic. The spiral form means it's more flexible, it offers greater support and doesn't distort in shape. However, steel boning isn't machine washable and involves a fair amount of elbow grease in cutting the pieces with tin snips, applying end caps, etc. So if you want an easily washable, less metal work intensive option, go for plastic. The next stage was to apply the lining to the bodice by pressing under the bottom edge and slip stitching it to the waistline seam by hand, machine basting the top edges together and slip stitching the edges of the lining to the zipper tape. Next, it was time to sew the straps. I stitched the strap pieces together, incorporating a small dart to form an angle, then turned them inside out and applied them to the back of the bodice by the zipper. I applied fusible interfacing to the facing pieces, stitched them together to form one piece and finished the flatter edge with a narrow hem. I then stitched it to the outside of the bodice at the top, clipped curves and understitched it to the seam thicknesses to make sure the facing would be stable and not roll around. I turned the facing inside the bodice and tack stitched it to the inside edges and lining. The armhole was formed by looping the back band and strap forward and down through the gaps in the top of the front band, securing them at the upper and side edges of the bodice with invisible hand stitching. Now, I'm not a huge fan of hand sewing and not very good at making it invisible, but I tried my best. This was probably the least enjoyable part of the process. I decided not to make the bow for the back. The print was eye-catching enough, so I didn't think it needed embellishment, and perhaps a bow would have made the dress a little less sophisticated. I moved straight on to hemming the skirt by stitching 5/8 of an inch from the bottom, turning up the raw edge and tucking it under before stitching the whole hem in place. So, the dress was finished. Well, in theory. In practice, there were some major problems. Although the majority of the bodice fitted reasonably well, the bust inserts were way too wide, meaning that the top of the bodice sagged and the straps fell off my shoulders. I'd used the pattern size recommended for my measurements, so I was totally at a loss for how it had turned out this way. I've since researched the pattern online and found that this has happened to others. Maybe it was the pattern, maybe it was me, or maybe it was both. Then again, I didn't make a mock-up, so I only have myself to blame. So again, I urge you, and myself, to make a muslin. It's the only way to avoid late night panic, butchering your lovingly sewn dress before a big event. Anyway, I had some drastic work to do to make it into a wearable garment. Due to the structure of the bodice, it was impossible to adapt it in a way that wasn't screamingly obvious, at least for me. The only way I could achieve the correct shape was to fold under around an inch and a half of each bust insert near the outer edges, and hand stitching the folded portion in place in a position which wouldn't distort the rounded edge of each insert. Adapting the bust inserts in this way moved the straps inwards, but in order to make sure that they actually sat straight, I had to shorten them considerably and change their angle by crossing them over at the back. This involved much seam ripping, pinning and trying on before it was perfect, but I got there in the end. Fortunately, the front of the bodice wasn't really affected by all this chaos. So, I present the finished product. Making this dress ended up being a bit of an ordeal, but in the end it was perfect for the occasion, very comfortable, and made me feel like a million galleons. Yes, the alterations looked blindingly obvious on closer viewing, but from a distance, did it really matter? I don't think so. After all, it's all about the fantasy. So, have you ever made a themed dress, combined a fandom and vintage style, or had to make some last-minute major alterations to save a garment before a big event? Let me know in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I'm going to post more vintage sewing videos on the channel soon, including one for a Daily Profit dress I've made using Gertie's L'Amour dress pattern. So keep an eye out for that one, and until next time, thanks for watching.